right. Okay, I'm going. Looking good. Looking pretty nice. Oh no, he's decabled. I've been decabled.
There we go. That's better. Oh yeah, that's fine. That looks fine.
Hey, how you doing? Is it going?
Yeah, I'm on.
Okay, cool. So the last time we recorded this, ironically, with the socially distanced one, I was actually sat further away from my computer because I was in some random room, and I found out that if I hold my microphone up here and move a bit further back, it doesn't pick up the background noise of my computer laptop fan when I have so many.
You're in a cupboard.
Tabs open. I was in a cupboard, yes. I was in a small cupboard, slowly going insane, talking to only one other human. Speaking of, let's talk about the lighthouse. That's not the opening. Good evening, morning, or afternoon, not necessarily in that order, and welcome to Movies and Martins, a sometimes weekly film podcast.
Podcast.
You see?
Hey, forget about it.
Forget about it. It's the Movies and Martins podcast. Sometimes weekly film podcast.
Special guest, two Fonzies.
I've got. Well, the problem is it's about the lighthouse, so I can't call the episode Two Fonzies, which I would do otherwise, because that'd be a really good discussion points. Two Fonzies.
We ever need to release like a clip version of this in between? Well, we can't record one and we're behind.
What, a clip show of just the dog shit you chat during the fucking opening segments.
The absolute dreck. Oh boy.
Yeah, like we mentioned earlier, this one is a follow-up to our episode 2 weeks ago about The Lighthouse, Robert Eggers' 2019 film. And in it we talk about how I really love the film, but Martin didn't much enjoy his watch, so we talk about kind of mood, personal opinions, and how the kind of conditions in which you watch something really impact your takeaway from a film. So yeah, I told you to watch this film because I said I absolutely loved it. I've watched it twice now. I've watched it twice, and I've watched like little bits and pieces. My favourite scenes I've rewatched a couple of times as well. But I've watched the whole thing through twice at this point. I watched it again about 2-3 weeks ago, I think. Maybe a bit longer than that. Actually, it might be like 3 weeks to a month ago because we did our other episode then. And yeah, so I told you to watch it. You watched it this morning, is that correct?
I watched it yesterday evening. So
yesterday evening.
You've painted a far more magical viewing experience than I had from the cooped up in my half-assembled flat in the northwest of England on a laptop, and
a desk with no chair, so you were squatting for 2 hours.
Just permanently squatting. So truly living the labour-intense experience of what it is to work in a lighthouse.
You were Robert Pattinson and the film was Willem Dafoe.
Yeah.
Making you sweat for it. So what were your first thoughts about it? Because you obviously watched it yesterday. So what was your kind of initial takeaways from it? Because you weren't quite as positive going in on it than I was, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so it's on the list of things that I definitely kind of passed me by, but are things I'm like, I should go back and watch this at some point. And it was something I needed to go and watch because of all the buzz that was around it in terms of criticism and things like that. So I was going to go watch it at some point. But I found myself several times just sort of wiggling the mouse on my laptop and being like, there's still an hour and 20 minutes left. Oh, God, there's still an hour left. Oh, God, we still got half an hour left. I'm very confounded by it. It's a very conflicted opinion, I think, overall, in that I think that it's a very accomplished film. It achieves a lot of things that it sets out to do, and it shows off that that Robert Eggers is a very, very cinema literate and very capable director, and everyone else who worked on this film clearly are very talented people because they've achieved something very impressive. But for me,
Yeah.
The Lighthouse felt like a film that you endured and confronted rather than necessarily enjoyed.
I can definitely see that. Yeah. So what do you think about it that you kind of bounced off in particular? Because you say so it was kind of like this kind of specific bleakness about it.
Yeah, so I'll hold off on it because I want to discuss it a bit more when we get into like picking things apart. But just generally, I found it almost too bleak to actually get involved in and get sort of immersed in, because there's a lot of things that it does to try and really draw you in to this like very small locale and this very sort of insular community, so that effectively you become like the third person who's working at this lighthouse, like isolated little rock lighthouse. But I think I found it just literally too oppressive. And again, that feeds back into being like, it's clearly very good and it does what it wants to do because that's the mood it wants to create. But also, I think
It's
almost
not for you.
From that, it became quite a difficult one to sit through.
I sort of think it's kind of like it's almost like it's maybe struck you not just at a bad time, but the way the film is paced and edited and sort of and composed almost. If you do not get invested, or if you have something blocking that, be it how the characters are done or how you're feeling about that genre, or just if it's a bit too bleak, whatever. If you bounce off it initially, it's quite a hard buy-in for the whole film.
I'm reminded almost not to devalue The Lighthouse because it's significantly better than what I'm about to mention.
You're about to mention Cats.
No, not Cats. I'm about to mention how when I was really into watching The Walking Dead, I sort of fell off it and then wanted to get back into it and ended up having to watch
then you watched season 2.
I watched about 3 seasons on the trot, including season 2, which is the most boring season of TV I've ever watched. I watched it in like the space of a couple of weeks because season 5 was coming up that quickly, and I found myself just so laboured. And I despite the fact that I think season 5 is probably one of the better seasons of that show, I don't watch it anymore, so it could be better, it could be worse. But I was also like, God, this is just a lot to take in, isn't it?
I guess maybe it's a similar thing to like the prospect of Game of Thrones. For me, like a bleak, low fantasy setting. I'm like, be honest with you, I watched the first episode. It ended with some questionable incest. Not that there's non-questionable incest that exists, but a particularly questionable example of incest. And a boy falls off a tower, and then there's, I don't know, wolves eat him or something. I don't know. But I was like, well, do I want to sit into what, like 100 hours of watching this? I didn't really fancy it. So I guess it's like the case with a lot of media, isn't it? Like you bounce off it. It's sort of like me and say a game like Bloodborne. I wasn't really in the right place to figure out how like the buy-in for it's like I didn't figure out how the game played. It almost, or like I can do the mechanics. I couldn't quite like click with it, and so that kind of stopped me from engaging with what I've come to now enjoy was one of the best games I've played. But I suppose almost like the kind of the mechanical inputs of a film are how it looks, what tone it establishes, and if that's not the right thing for you, it must be quite hard to get that investment. So I guess I'm sorry for subjecting you to it.
No, so this is the thing is that's why I'm describing myself as confounded by it, because it's not an experience that I didn't necessarily not enjoy, but it wasn't necessarily in the same way that I could sit down and rewatch one of the films on our first episode.
Scott Pilgrim.
Times. Yeah, probably Scott Pilgrim. Or the amount of times I've watched Hot Fuzz. I do, however, think it is something that I will try and revisit maybe in a month or two's time.
Maybe a bit later on. Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
Because I think there's a lot to appreciate here.
I think especially a film like this, in terms of it being about isolation and not being able to go anywhere and being stuck for suddenly longer than you expected. Eggers probably didn't expect it to be like so topically relevant, but topically relevant stuff like that, it's like, well, I'm seeing this all on the news at the moment anyway. Why would I come into a film for it? Because I similarly thought it was quite bleak in this current moment when I went to rewatch it, but for some reason I really gelled to that. this time round. I enjoyed it when I watched it the first time, but it might be because I enjoyed it the first time. I just gelled to it more when I rewatch.
In a similar sort of vein, the viewing statistics for Contagion, where it's being streamed, are massively up, and have been throughout the entire period.
Oh, Netflix became the most watched film. Sorry, I said Netflix became the most watched film on Netflix. Contagion became the most watched film on Netflix. Like about a week or two into lockdown, I think. I've still not watched it actually. Contagion.
It's worth it.
Have you watched it?
Yeah, it is worth it.
Well, we found our next episode. Great, wink. We'll get on the Contagion hot take train about 3 months after everyone else did.
One mechanical thing I would like to take you to task on.
Yes.
Because this is where
absolutely
we differ the most, I think, is that
yeah.
I found this film a real slog to get through. I thought, pacing-wise, for me, the sort of narrative that it is, for me, I found that the pacing was not erratic enough in that I wanted it to start as a slow burn because it needs to establish this real world thrust of energy to it. It needs to be beat for beat what the harsh experience of this horrible landscape is. But as it delves into its madness, for me it doesn't go fast enough or deep not deep enough in terms of textually or thematically, but it doesn't get there nearly as much or as often or as quickly as I think it should. Because for me, I think it should be a much steeper decline than it actually is into madness. Because that's how you're achieving a lot of the things and saying a lot of things that this film wants to say, is because by getting into those moments of mania. So for me, I found this nearly 2-hour film. I did find it quite exhausting to get through, and I wondered what you would rebut me with.
So, I think about the mania of this film like its eponymous subject. So, with a lighthouse, it doesn't just get gradually brighter and then stay a certain brightness. What it does is you have moments of darkness followed by a vroom, vroom of light as it goes around. You see that throughout the film, right? And that's kind of what the mania of this film is. It's part of the cyclical nature of how it builds its different layers of mythos and how it talks about different dialectics or struggles throughout the film between different themes. The reason that it's not a steady kind of it's not, what's the word?
I guess accelerating.
Steady acceleration, you're right. It's not a steady acceleration because that's not how madness often manifests. It's not just this downward... It's not a downward slope, it's a spiral. So I think as the moments of intensity, every time it comes around and you see the light of this mania, you see it in these scenes with the two of them together, each time it starts to get more and more intense. And there are these long moments of not having it. I think if you structured it in the way that you want it to be structured, with this kind of gradual decline, the first half of the film would be completely unwatchable and really boring. The last half of the film would be complete nonsense. I think you need these moments to breathe between these scenes for what you've just seen to actually sink in. So I agree with you, there's not much going on the thing in those moments when he's, say, moving stuff up the hill, but there are still things happening. They're still reinforcing themes with the kind of the images of Sisyphus as he moves up, or his rough struggle against putting things out of the water with the rope that was really taxing for him. And these scenes of physical labour, I think, really heavily juxtapose with the kind of more abstract horror and craziness that goes on. I think it adds so I think I understand why you feel that way. I understand, like, if the film you haven't quite bought into the film at the start with these kind of initial moments, why these so essentially what it's kind of almost a contrast between day and night, isn't it? So these scenes that you're talking about, these kind of lulls, they happen all at day during the light when he's labouring, and the madness sets in at night. And that's kind of what it's drawing on, like, sort of emotions of werewolves as well, kind of this kind of mania happening during the evening. This kind of day and night cycle of the film almost. I think those scenes during the day, they build quite a lot of tension as well as allowing you to relax. So allowing you to decompress from the mania you've previously experienced. Throughout the day, you know some shit's going to go on in the evening.
Yeah, and I don't mean to sort of suggest that you hand wave the those, because they are important, and I'm completely on board with you. That if you just had regular moments of what I'm saying is like daytime labour, boom, here's a moment. 20 minutes later, you have the same thing. 20 minutes later, you have it again. I don't mean to suggest that's how it should be quite as rigid as that. What I mean to say is that the way that
it's too long. Those interstitial scenes.
Those interstitials for me are too over long, and the way I encountered it as a viewer for the first time, the mania effectively became the catharsis from this mundane sequence, which I don't think is necessarily the way it wants the film wants you to interpret it. Is I was watching it and here's a moment of drama, I'm engaged, and then it would drop back into lengthy scene of labour, and I'm like, I understand what it's trying to achieve with this, but for me there's too much of it and there's too long.
So we talked about this before in terms of Christopher Nolan, but I think the way this film front loads its aesthetics and its themes, right? I think it doesn't suit itself well to a first viewing being on like a computer or on a TV, and that's not. I'm not saying it's a fault of the viewer who sees this. I think it's potentially a fault in how. It's not necessarily a fault, but it's kind of a fault in how cinema is constructed itself. In that those scenes are especially effective when you first view them in a cinema, because the soundscape is literally. It's escape. It's not just in your ears, which even the best pair of headphones cannot replicate surround sound.
No.
Like you're sitting you're surrounded by the ambient audio and the really bright, stark visual contrast. Because on a computer, the kind of really bright but dull greys of the daytime do not come across as brilliant and almost white as they do in the cinema. And so I think that maybe is a fault of the kind of the film's translation out of screen-based media, if that makes sense. It's not, so that's not to say a fault of you for I'm not saying you've watched it wrong, but I'm saying I think it's maybe a fault almost of the conventions of film, maybe what they're going for. And I kind of understand what you see with that. I think for me, even on my rewatch, I didn't find them too tedious. I felt... but there are moments of drama that appear within those lapsing moments as well. So all the conflict with the seagull happens then, all the conflict with him finding things abandoned on the lakes. I think some of the weirdest and starkest moments of actual horrific elements of the film are like when he discovers the really horrible carcass of the mermaid on the beach. And that's when you start to see the mania really set in and seep in through the day. So without these kind of longer moments of respite, those elements of the weird creeping into those moments of sanity later on wouldn't have quite the same effect. But I can understand why those might kind of get a bit kind of grating at times. I think my main defense of them, as it were, would be, I think, if they were much shorter, I think the slightly characterized performance you see from a drunken Pattinson and Dafoe's general demeanour would potentially become a bit grating if they're viewed in too close a proximity to each other. So I think that's probably why they tend... I think I agree with you, they probably tend more to the longer than the shorter. So I know you're not saying shorter's better, but I think the reason they stray towards the longer is to make sure you get enough breathing space between the moments of mania, I think, would be my main sort of consideration of it. I think.
And I take the point about viewing experience anyway, because I'm aware that this is definitely a film. I think it has to have coloured it, even if it's not consciously, because I'm not able
everything
to.
colours because watching the film.
I'm not able to buy into the atmosphere that they're creating with this massive, like, oppressive soundscape, and the viewing aspect ratio on a cinema screen would be much more jarring than it is watching it on a laptop in a window on Netflix.
I'll agree with you on that. It's much less arresting on a screen, which is definitely what I experienced when I rewatched it. It was much less arresting on my computer screen than it was in the thing. I think maybe I'm slightly biased towards it because I've seen it in cinema. It's always a rewatch is always going to be evocative of the first time I saw it, so I can kind of I can personally probably hand wave that away a bit easier than maybe others could.
It's why, just as a side note, I try and keep if I'm gonna go and watch something, I always try and see it when it's out. But that didn't happen in this case, so
Yeah. Well, I guess like subconscious like things like that always affect you watch a film. Like in retrospect, Toy Story 4 wasn't a masterpiece by any means, but you and me were both bawling by the end of it because it was we were both finishing our time together at university as best mates there, and I sort of say that you aren't my friend anymore. Fuck off, man. That's my way of ending it. It's we were overly emotional potentially, or more emotionally vulnerable in that moment because of the context we were watching it in, so it was more resonant. In the same way in this instance, for you, the kind of buy-in of the really oppressive atmosphere of isolation probably isn't as compelling when the real world is much more isolated and oppressive and scary right now. It probably has less of an effect when we're in the stage of a global pandemic, that kind of attempt to garner fear through that method.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah, so do you want to do should we do a clap now?
Yeah, alright.
Good time, is anything to do it? Okay, so I'm going to go with, because I'm holding the microphone, I'm going to go with classic Martin belly smack technique. I'm going to belly smack to 5, and on 5 you join my clap. You don't have to belly smack if you want to. It's an open zone. Okay, Martin Shaw has primed his hands over his belly, ready to deploy the smack. Okay, I'm going to begin my countdown now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't hear that, but I'm assuming it picked up on your thing.
Oh, I mean, I have one there, and it was pretty good, I think. Do you want to do another one,
fine.
just in case?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
okay, ready, and
I'll just do a clap.
I feel like that's all the bit of Wolf of Wall Street. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's much better. That sounded good to me. I heard that.